Welcome to week 4 and our look at the gospel according to Galatians and the gospel according to First John. We've been looking at culture in the first week, cognitive environment, then Luke and Acts, the different ways that the gospel was presented, the different ways that evangelism took place and that discipleship took place in the kind of rich cultural variety that we find as we move from Luke 1 to the end of Acts along the way. And I've selected Galatians and First John primarily because they are so dramatically different. And in them we find not only two authors, but two communities. And so I think this gives us some really wonderful insight into issues of cross-cultural evangelism, and in this case, particularly cross-cultural discipleship, because the letters are not evangelistic in nature. They're the ongoing follow-up, discipleship, and establishing of a community of people. So they give us windows into that and kind of the nature of the cross-cultural realities involved in discipleship as well. So looking at Galatians first and Paul, as I said, there's two authors, two communities. So let's look first at the two authors. So here's Paul. And if you just take his whole body of work, all his letters, the sermons in Acts, etc., you begin to get a composite picture of the themes, the way he talks, the way he writes, the things he emphasizes. Notice that it does vary in his letters. If you read Galatians right next to Colossians, or you read Galatians next to First Timothy, or Corinthians for that matter, you're going to find very different themes, similar themes as well, and some common things. There's Paul being Paul, but you're also going to find differences and nuances. And that will be less true when you turn to John. And that well could be because of the fact that it is very likely that John was not writing to multiple communities, different times, that First John is probably written to the same community as Second John and Third John and the Gospel, for example. So the whole interplay of the person and their community does come into play when we see the differences in Paul. So for Paul, although he's the same guy, we find him writing differently in different letters. What's my whole point in that? He is culturally sensitive as he thinks about discipleship and how he's addressing particular issues in a particular people. Discipleship is not monolithic, in other words. I am incredibly suspicious of any discipleship program that does not take into account the specific needs of the people that it's addressing. That's one insight that we can take just from how Paul himself, even though he's the same guy writing all those different letters, he can sound like a very different guy because he's dealing with issues, not just dealing with the issues in those people, different cities that he writes to, Colossae, Corinth, Galatian region, Rome, etc., but also drawing from what he knows of the people and the environment. So he's a very contextual disciple maker. Now John, when he writes his letters, first thing I want you to notice is just putting John and Paul next to each other and the style in which they write, the themes. If this was a course in which I was requiring you to read things in Greek, we would see that the way they use the language is very, very different. One of the wonderful things about John is he uses very simple Greek. One of the difficult things about John is he uses very simple Greek because he's pouring such deep meaning into very simple language that it's sometimes hard. It makes it actually very dense to try to pull out what he's meaning. He doesn't have as much vocabulary breadth as Paul does in his letters. So as I said, that makes it easier and more difficult all at the same time. So my whole point here is Paul and John, two very different people. Galatians and the community that John writes to, very different communities. Now, um, here's one more point about that. First of all, we're just talking about the contextual differences in how we go about discipleship. But here's something I want us to realize. It's very likely that the community that John was addressing was in or near Ephesus. We know that John has a lot of connection to Ephesus, and historically there's a lot of connectivity between the Apostle John and the Ephesian community. But it would seem likely that it is not the same group of believers that Paul is addressing when he writes to the Ephesians. I don't have time to go into my whole rationale for that, but I think there's something similar going on when you compare, for example, 1 Peter, and the introduction there lists all the different regions that Peter's writing to, or the people and where they're from. They very much overlap with Paul, but it's very unclear whether these are the same groups of churches or not. I'm sharing that because I think the New Testament church and network of emerging communities had a lot more variety and a lot more complexity to it than what we normally think about. So I just want us to keep that in mind. And so again, Galatians, two different authors with their own personality, their own personal sort of cultural appropriation in some ways of the gospel and how they communicate it, and two different communities. So one of the things that I'm going to want us to reflect on is that you yourself, I myself, have my own personal history and way, and even culture, we could say, of how I've appropriated and then communicate the gospel. And then there's the community to whom I am communicating it, or with whom I'm engaged as I do that. And that will shape, or should shape, how we go about cross-cultural evangelism and discipleship, which is the topic of our course. All right, enjoy the reading, and talk to you online.